This move, 1, d4, is a fundamental opening choice that immediately stakes a claim in the center and opens diagonals for the queen and bishop, aiming for rapid development and control of key central squares. This move, nf6, is a fundamental developing move that controls the central e4 and d5 squares, prepares for castling, and is the hallmark of many sophisticated Indian defenses, offering white various opening choices. This move immediately stakes a claim in the center and aims to control key squares, preparing to develop pieces and build a strong pawn structure, characteristic of many popular queen's pawn openings like the King's Indian or Queen's Gambit. This move transposes into a Queen's Indian defense or Nimzo Indian defense setup, aiming to control the center with pawns and pieces while preparing to develop the kingside bishop. This move develops a knight towards the center and supports the pawn on d4, aiming for control of central squares and preparing for further development, common in the Queen's Indian or Nimzo Indian complex of openings. This move, often seen in the Nimzo Indian defense, immediately challenges white's central pawn structure and aims to disrupt white's coordination by preparing to double white's pawns on the c-file. This move challenges black's bishop immediately, forcing a decision on whether to retreat or exchange, thus clarifying the pawn structure and potential piece activity in the center. By exchanging the bishop for the knight, black concedes the bishop pair but simplifies the position and avoids further pawn structure weaknesses that might arise from recapturing on c3 with a pawn. This recapture opens the b-file for white's rook and creates an unbalanced pawn structure, potentially leading to dynamic play. This move immediately challenges white's central pawn majority, aiming to gain space and potentially create an isolated queen's pawn for white if the c-pawn is captured. This move aims to secure the center and prepare for a kingside pawn advance, though it creates structural weaknesses around the king. This move, 6, d6, aims to reinforce the central pawn chain and prepare for nc6, developing a piece while also supporting a potential advance of the c-pawn in response to white's doubled pawns. This move boldly stakes a claim in the center, aiming to open lines and develop aggressively while preparing to castle kingside. This move develops a piece and prepares to challenge white's central pawn structure, aiming for greater piece activity. This move develops the knight to a more central square, preparing to castle and support the central pawn push of e4. This move prepares to develop the queen's bishop to a fianchettoed position on b7, aiming to control the long diagonal and put pressure on white's queenside pawns. This knight maneuver prepares to occupy the advantageous g5 square, potentially supporting pawn advances or pressuring black's kingside. Developing the king to safety is a standard and necessary prophylactic measure in this position, preparing for potential central pawn pushes and the activation of the g8 rook. This move decisively challenges black's central pawn on d6, aiming to gain space and control crucial central squares while preparing to launch a kingside attack. The knight's maneuver to a5 is a strategic repositioning, aiming to displace white's c3 pawn and potentially create weaknesses on the queenside by forcing a pawn advance or opening a file. Developing the bishop to a more active diagonal and preparing for kingside castling provides white with better piece coordination and pawn structure support. This move Briar system-like development repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, aiming to challenge white's central control and prepare for potential pawn breaks on the queenside. This move centralizes the queen, aiming to support the central pawn push and prepare for potential queenside play while also connecting the rooks for future operations. This move strategically repositions the knight to a more active central square, aiming to control key central squares and prepare for potential pawn breaks or piece activity on the kingside. This move initiates a central pawn advance, aiming to gain space and restrict black's pieces, particularly the knight on a5, while preparing for further expansion on the kingside. This move opens the e-file for black's rook and aims to disrupt white's pawn center. But it also relinquishes the central space advantage white was building. This capture opens the c-file, creating immediate tension and forcing black to clarify the pawn structure, impacting piece activity and control of central squares. This move, while seemingly simple, clarifies the pawn structure and opens the d-file for potential action. But white's doubled c-pawns now present a structural weakness to exploit. This recapture on d3 re-establishes the queenside pawn majority, aiming to leverage the open c-file for queenside pressure while preparing to develop the kingside pieces more actively. This move challenges white's central pawn chain and aims to gain space on the queenside. But it concedes control of the d5 square and can lead to structural weaknesses if not handled carefully. This move centralizes the queen to support the f4 pawn push and prepare for a potential queenside expansion by black, while also aiming to control key central squares and potentially harass black's king. This move by black is a tactical insertion, aiming to exploit white's slightly underdeveloped queenside by forcing the white queen to move in, potentially creating weaknesses around white's c3 pawn. This move prepares to contest the open b-file, potentially supporting a pawn advance with b4 or initiating a queenside counterplay. The move re8 supports the pawn on e6, prepares to contest the open e-file, and potentially allows for the advance of the d-pawn. The immediate castling by white resolves the king's safety issue and brings the rook into play, anticipating potential central pawn breaks and reinforcing the queenside. This move activates the knight, preparing to contest the crucial d5 square and potentially harass white's queenside pawn structure. This move strategically positions the bishop to potentially pressure black's queenside pawn structure and supports the advance of the f4 pawn. This bold exchange sacrifices a pawn to disrupt white's central pawn structure and open lines for black's pieces, creating tactical complications and dynamic counterplay. This move resolves the immediate threat of the knight on c5 and frees up the f4 pawn, initiating a critical pawn exchange that will simplify the position and open up lines for your pieces. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, preparing to challenge white's central pawn structure and potentially exploit the weakness on d5. This move actively challenges black's knight on a5, aiming to force a favorable trade that improves white's piece activity and central control. This move forces a queen exchange, simplifying the position and removing white's most active attacking piece, which is a logical step given black's queenside pressure. This recapture on e3 maintains material equality and simplifies the position. But importantly, the doubled c-pawns now become a structural weakness that black can target, creating dynamic attacking chances on the queenside. This rook sacrifice exchanges material to eliminate white's strong central pawn presence and open lines for black's remaining pieces. White recaptures the pawn on c4, opening the c-file and aiming to simplify the position while gaining material equality after the exchange of queens. This move captures a pawn, but the rook's position on the third rank is awkward, and white now has a strong central pawn majority with open lines for their pieces. This move initiates a critical endgame phase by seizing the undefended d6 pawn. creating an immediate material advantage and centralizing the knight for future attacking possibilities. Black recaptures with the knight, activating it to a strong central outpost and threatening white's isolated c4 pawn. This move on the c-file recaptures the pawn lost earlier and centralizes the rook, contesting the open file against black's rook and preparing to challenge white's material advantage. This move, road 3, aims to reinforce the d-file, contest white's control, and potentially prepare for a later advance of the d-pawn, but it neglects the crucial defense of the c-file where white's rook is actively placed. This move activates the rook, bringing it to a central file where it can contest control and potentially pressure black's rook on d3, aiming to eliminate the dangerous passed pawn or create defensive challenges for black. This move repositions the rook to an active file, aiming to contest the central pawn majority and develop counterplay against white's potentially exposed king. This move aims to centralize the knight, attacking white's passed pawn on d6 while simultaneously defending against black's advanced pawns. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, potentially aiming to attack the weak pawn on c3 or infiltrate white's queenside. This move aims to simplify the position by exchanging queens, leading to a rook endgame where white hopes to exploit their passed c-pawn and black's potential structural weaknesses. This recapture on c1 is forced and strategically sound, as black aims to disrupt white's coordination and simplify the position by trading off white's active rook. This move aims to activate the king by bringing it towards the center to support potential pawn advances and control important squares in the endgame. This move places the knight on a very active square, potentially targeting the d4 pawn and forcing white to commit to a defensive maneuver, while also defending the c5 square. The rook aggressively advances to the 7th rank, aiming to exploit the weakened pawn structure and potentially create a mating net or win material by attacking the remaining pawns and the vulnerable king. This move aims to challenge white's passed pawn on the d-file by creating counterplay on the kingside and potentially reinforcing black's central pawn structure. This knight maneuver supports the pawn's advance and prepares to capture the rook on c3, while also potentially forking the king and rook if black is not careful. This move recaptures the pawn and repositions the knight to a more active central square, aiming to disrupt white's pieces and contest control of the d-file. This move re7 repositions the rook to a more active square, aiming to pressure black's advanced knight and potentially create threats on the 7th rank or in the center. This move prepares to activate the king by creating a defensive pawn shield, allowing it to join the fight on the kingside while supporting the potential advance of the f-pawn. This knight maneuver aggressively targets the weak f7 square, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially create tactical threats against the black king. The king moves to safety on f8, escaping the direct threats on the e-file and preparing to support the potential pawn push to f5. The rook on c7 aims to exploit the weakened dark squares on black's queenside, specifically targeting the c4 pawn and restricting the movement of the black pieces. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, aiming to support the king and potentially participate in future defensive or offensive maneuvers, while also defending the e6 pawn. This move repositions the rook to the 2nd rank, targeting the weak b6 pawn and preparing to contest the open b-file, aiming to restrict black's queenside play and create attacking opportunities. The rook on e8 is reactivated to control the open e-file, potentially supporting a future pawn advance or preparing to contest the file with white's rook. This move is a repositioning of the knight to a more active central square, aiming to support potential pawn advances and improve the knight's influence on the board. The recapture of the pawn with the rook aims to centralize the rook and contest the open c-file, but allows white to reinforce their knight on d6. This move forces the black king to a less active square, potentially creating opportunities to attack the g6 pawn or infiltrate with the rook. This move tucks the king to safety on the 7th rank, preparing to support the pawn's advance to g6 and defend against potential threats from white's rook and knight. This pawn move prepares to activate the g2 rook by creating a clear path on the 3rd rank, potentially supporting a kingside advance or improving piece coordination. This move seeks to improve the knight's placement to a more active central square, potentially preparing for kingside play or creating threats against white's rook and pawn structure. This move forces the black king into a less protected square, potentially setting up a mating net or gaining material through tactics involving the knight and bishop. This move aims to centralize the king, preparing to support the likely advance of the f-pawn and potentially participate in the upcoming pawn endgame. This move is a forcing check that aims to exploit the exposed black king and disrupt black's defensive setup, potentially leading to material gains or a mating attack by forcing the king into a vulnerable square. This move forces white to decide how to deal with the king's predicament, potentially leading to a king walk or a tactical skirmish. This knight move aims to reposition the knight to a more active square, potentially to attack the black pawn on c4 or support a kingside initiative by rerouting through f3. The king seeks activity in the endgame, aiming to support the central pawns and potentially create threats against white's kingside. This move repositions the knight to a more active central square, supporting the pawn push and preparing to attack the black king. The knight repositions to c6, reinforcing the potential d4 square and preparing to contest the open c-file while maintaining flexibility for future pawn advances or piece maneuvering. This move initiates a decisive exchange in a difficult endgame for black, aiming to simplify into a winning position by trading off black's active knight and consolidating the extra pawn advantage. The king ventures out to recapture the pawn, aiming to consolidate the material advantage and defend the central pawn structure as the game enters a simplified endgame phase. The rook's advance to g8 supports the central pawn and prepares to potentially attack the king once it's forced into the open. The move 44, kb5 is a good defensive maneuver, moving the king to a safer square on the queenside and out of the immediate threat of white's rook and passed pawn, while preparing to support the remaining pawns. This move initiates a kingside pawn advance, aiming to create potential attacking chances or support a future king sortie. This move prepares to contest the crucial open f-file, potentially leading to exchanges that could simplify the position and offer a clearer path for black's rook. This move activates the king by moving it to a more central and active square, aiming to participate in the endgame and support the remaining pawns. The move aims to activate the king by bringing it closer to the queenside pawns, preparing to support their advance and potentially create counterplay against white's centralized pieces. This pawn push creates an outpost for the white knight and prepares to advance the kingside pawns, potentially opening lines towards black's king. This move recaptures the pawn, opening the g-file for the rook and aiming to activate it along the newly opened file to pressure the white king. This is a classic endgame scenario where the king's central activation is paramount for controlling squares and supporting pawn advances. The move correctly identifies the opportunity to capture a pawn, but it sacrifices the opportunity to create a passed pawn with the remaining pieces. The move 49, k5 is a crucial step to consolidate the king's position and prepare for the final endgame phase, aiming to control central squares and support the advance of the remaining pawns. The move 49, b5 is a critical pawn push to create a passed pawn on the queenside, aiming to gain counterplay and potentially distract white's king from the kingside action. This rook move activates the rook to a potentially open file, supporting further pawn advances and threatening the black king if it remains passive. This move aims to activate the queenside pawn majority by advancing one of them, creating threats and potentially forcing the rook to a less active position. The king advances aggressively into the opponent's territory, aiming to support the passed b-pawn and create mating threats. The rook now actively defends the pawn and prepares to support a potential kingside advance or two. Trade off black's active knight. This move repositions the rook to control the 7th rank and prepare to attack the weak black pawns on the kingside or potentially pressure the b-pawn after a subsequent pawn advance. With the rook now centralized on the 7th rank and threatening the weak b5 pawn, white hopes to expand their advantage by further solidifying their queenside presence.